60% of Finnish men carry a Y chromosome that came from Siberia, not from Scandinavia, not from the steppes of Central Europe, from northeastern Siberia, a region geographically closer to Alaska than to Helsinki. Yet Finland is a European country with a genome that is overwhelmingly European. 90% European ancestry, in fact. The Siberian signal that defines Finnish genetic uniqueness, that separates Finland from every other large population on the continent, constitutes roughly 10% of the Finnish genome. That collision between what Finland is and where its defining difference came from is what this video is about. That is the part of the story everyone knows. Here is the part almost nobody does. The 10% did not just shape Finland genetically. It gave Finland its language. Finnish, Estonian, Hungarian, the entire Uralic language family, spoken today by more than 25 million people, traces to that 10%. A small group of people carrying bronze technology moved west from northeastern Siberia somewhere around 4,000 years ago, left a minority fraction of their DNA in the Finnish genome, and gave an entire nation its linguistic identity entirely. The genome went one way, the language went another, and understanding why those two things came apart tells you something genuinely important about how human populations work. The story does not begin with Siberia, it begins with ice. Finland was first settled around 10,000 years ago, when the glaciers of the last ice age retreated north and left the land habitable for the first time. The people who moved in were hunter-gatherers, the ancient European lineage that had survived the ice age in refugia further south and followed the receding ice northward. These were among the last hunter-gatherers in all of Europe to adopt farming, while Neolithic agricultural communities were spreading across the continent from Anatolia, replacing and absorbing the hunter-gatherer populations in their path. The comb ceramic culture of Northern Europe, whose territory included what is now Finland, resisted farming for roughly 2,000 years longer than anyone else. 2,000 years, not a generation, not a century. 2 millennia of cultural and biological resistance while the rest of the continent transformed around them. That resistance left a trace. Finns today retain higher levels of ancient European hunter-gatherer ancestry than almost any other large population on the continent. 1 in 5 Finnish women still carries haplogroup U5 in her mitochondrial DNA, a lineage that dates back 35,000 to 45,000 years to the original post-Ice Age colonizers of Europe. That is not a relic. That is a living signal of the people who were here before farming, before bronze, before anything we would recognize as civilization. They were absorbed eventually, but never fully replaced. Their genome is still there, in the maternal lines, persistent and measurable. Then, around 2800 BCE, the corded Ware people arrived. The corded Ware expansion is one of the most dramatic population events in all of European prehistory. These were steppe pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian region, carrying the genetic signature now known as Yamnaya ancestry, and they reshaped the genetics of virtually every European population they encountered. In Britain, ancient DNA shows they replaced approximately 90% of the existing population within a few centuries. They brought Indo-European languages to most of the continent. They were, by every genetic measure, one of the most successful expanding populations in European history. They arrived in Finland, and they lost the language. I find that fact genuinely difficult to hold at first. A population expansion so successful it linguistically conquered a continent, including Scandinavia, including the Baltic, including territories immediately adjacent to Finland, failed to impose its language on Finland specifically. Finland is the only region in all of Europe where the corded Ware genetic signal arrived in force, and the Indo-European language did not follow. Something had already been there, or was arriving at the same time, that proved linguistically stronger. And identifying what that was took over a century of academic argument. Here is where the mechanism becomes specific. Archaeologists had long noticed something called the Seima-Turbino phenomenon, a sudden appearance around 4,000 years ago of technically advanced bronze casting methods spreading rapidly across northern Eurasia, from the eastern steppes all the way to Finland and Scandinavia. The people responsible were not a conquering army. They left no fortifications, no signs of warfare, no mass displacement of populations. What they left was bronze, superior weapons, tools, and casting techniques appearing along a network that stretched thousands of miles, carried by what researchers describe as hyper-mobile, nomadic groups. Small, fast-moving, technologically ahead of every population they encountered. David Reich's lab at Harvard has called this network a kind of proto-United Nations of the prehistoric North. Not a state, not an empire, but a trading corridor that moved ideas, technology, and people across an enormous geography. The question of where those people originated, where the Uralic language they carried came from, had been debated by linguists and archaeologists for more than 100 years. The mainstream answer placed the Uralic homeland somewhere near the Ural Mountains, roughly 860 miles east of Moscow. That answer stood as the dominant academic consensus for over a century. Then, in July of 2025, a paper published in Nature moved the origin approximately 3,000 miles further east. I was not prepared for how far east the answer was going to be. The analysis was led by doctoral candidates Alexander Kim and Yun Zheng in David Reich's Ancient DNA Laboratory at Harvard, integrating genomic data from 180 newly sequenced ancient Siberians with over 1,000 existing samples spanning 11,000 years of human history. The results placed the ancestors of all present-day Uralic speakers, the people whose descendants would eventually speak Finnish, Estonian, and Hungarian, living around 4,500 years ago in a region now known as Yakutia in northeastern Siberia. As Kim described it, geographically, Yakutia is closer to Alaska or Japan than it is to Finland. The language that defines Finnish identity did not come from a neighboring region. It came from the other side of the world's largest landmass. And that language was carried by people who left only 10% of their genome behind when they arrived. That is the centerpiece of this story and the hardest thing to absorb. The Yakutia-derived Siberian ancestry in modern Finns is not the dominant genetic force in Finland. It is the minority. Estonians, another Uralic-speaking people, carry only about 2%. At the other extreme, the Anganasan people of northern Russia carry close to 100%. Finns sit at roughly 10%, enough to be measurable and distinct, not enough to overturn the overwhelmingly European character of the Finnish genome. A small group of mobile bronze traders moved west from northeastern Siberia across a distance most populations of that era would have traversed in generations, carrying a language, and left a fingerprint that is 10% of the genome and 100% of the linguistic identity. I could not move past that ratio when I first encountered it. 10%, 100%. It is one of the clearest demonstrations in population genetics of how language and biology decouple. How a small incoming group can linguistically transform a population without genetically replacing it. But the Siberian migration brought something else with it, something that only became clear much later. Around 4,000 years ago, at the time of this Siberian arrival, the Finnish male founding population went through a bottleneck so severe it has very few parallels anywhere in Europe. Based on molecular data, all Finnish Y chromosome diversity traces back to approximately 2 founding male lineages. 2. The entire paternal genetic heritage of 5 million modern Finns flows from that narrowing. To put that in perspective, Finnish Y chromosome diversity is lower than that found in many Native American populations, peoples who crossed a land bridge from Asia into a previously uninhabited continent. The isolation and the bottleneck compressed the Finnish male gene pool into something almost without parallel in a modern European nation. The consequence has a name: the Finnish disease heritage. 36 rare, recessive genetic disorders, conditions that occur only sporadically in the rest of the world, are significantly enriched in Finland because of that 4,000-year-old compression. One single founder mutation accounts for 70 to 100% of the alleles for each of these diseases. When Finland was genetically narrow enough, certain mutations that would ordinarily be diluted by population diversity instead propagated through every subsequent generation. The bottleneck is still visible in Finnish hospitals today. The same narrowing that concentrated disease in Finland has made Finland one of the most scientifically valuable genetic populations on Earth. In large, diverse populations, rare disease variants are scattered across hundreds of different mutations. Finding them requires sequencing hundreds of thousands of people before the pattern becomes visible. In Finland, the bottleneck concentrated those same variants onto a small number of common mutations, making them findable with far fewer samples. The FinGen study, published in Nature in 2023 and enrolling 500,000 Finnish participants, nearly 10% of Finland's entire population, has already identified 2,500 genomic regions linked to disease across 1,900 conditions. Protective variants were concentrated by the bottleneck too. One example is a variant in the gene A NGPT7 enriched in Finland. that appears to be protective against glaucoma. The isolation that made Finland genetically unusual is now one of the most powerful tools in global medicine. Honestly, that reversal took me a moment to fully absorb. 4,000 years of geographic isolation, a near catastrophic compression of the founding male lineage, 36 diseases amplified by a demographic accident. And the result is that Finnish DNA is now saving lives on the other side of the planet. Every Finnish person alive today carries the evidence of a narrowing, and that narrowing has a geography inside it. Finland possesses one of the strongest internal genetic divisions in Europe, stronger than the genetic difference between British and Northern German populations, who are citizens of different countries. Eastern Finns carry a higher Siberian ancestry signal and are dominated by haplogroup N1C. Western Finns carry substantially more Scandinavian influence, with haplogroup I1A more prominent. The genetic boundary between those two profiles is not gradual. It is a line, and that line maps almost precisely onto the border established by the Treaty of Göteborg in 1323 CE, a political boundary drawn between Sweden and the Republic of Novgorod that divided Western Catholic Finnish territory from Eastern Orthodox Finnish territory. A medieval empire border is readable in Finnish DNA 700 years later, not in documents, not in cultural memory, in haplogroup frequencies. This entire story has been building towards Siberia as a defining force in Finnish DNA, the arrival that made Finland different, the haplogroup N signal, the Yakutia ancestry, the Uralic language, the bottleneck. And all of that is accurate, but here is what it obscures. Finns are not primarily Siberian, they are primarily European. Approximately 90% of the Finnish genome traces to European hunter-gatherers, Anatolian farmers, and steppe peoples. The same three ancestral layers that compose every other European population. The ancient hunter-gatherer signal is actually stronger in Finland than in most of Europe, preserved by the same isolation that made everything else about Finland unusual. What makes Finland genetically unique is not what Finns are. It is what 10% of them became. The Siberian migration gave Finland its language and nothing else that could be called a majority. The Finnish genome is a European genome that speaks a Siberian language. And that sentence, which sounds like a paradox, is actually the most precise genetic description of Finland available. What does this mean? Beyond the data, it means that language and genome are not the same archive. The Finnish case is the clearest demonstration of that principle anywhere in European population genetics. The corded Ware people, who genetically dominate most of Northern Europe, could not overwrite a language that arrived from a direction no one expected. A small group of Siberian bronze traders linguistically transformed a continent's northeastern corner without demographically replacing it. And the population that remained, primarily European, primarily descended from Ice Age survivors, kept the language and forgot, over millennia, where it came from. If you made it to the end, thank you, genuinely. A like costs nothing and helps more than most people realize. If ancient DNA, genetic origins, and the stories that sit underneath European history are things you keep coming back to, subscribing is the simplest way to stay close to it. Share this with anyone who has Finnish roots, or anyone who finds this particular rabbit hole as hard to climb out of as I do. Thanks for being here.